We'll be starting the session in just a moment. If you have any connection or technical issues, try refreshing your browser first. If this doesn't work, please go to the Help Desk by clicking Sessions on the left, or click the Attendee tab on the right and search Help Desk to send a private message. Thank you for joining us.
Hello and welcome back from the break, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's session called Frontiers of Research: From Phytochemicals and Immunity to the Microbiome, Connecting Personal and Planetary Health. To open up the session, I want to highlight that every year the global scientific community turns up new findings and uncovers promising new lines of inquiry about what constitutes an optimal diet to prevent chronic disease, maintain normal weight, and support robust well-being and longevity aspirations. At the same time, cross-disciplinary scientific collaboration is increasingly aligning that work with evolving concepts of sustainable planetary health diets. During the pandemic, many chefs and operators heard requests for immunity-boosting foods from their customers. And many of those same customers are reading about food-related gut health and the microbiome, and also know that we are still just scratching the surface in terms of our understanding about the protective properties of the whole spectrum of phytochemicals and the star power of the plant kingdom. In this session, we'll hear some top-line bulletins from the front lines of research and discuss how our evolving state of knowledge is sparking innovation in menu development and restaurant concepts. Finally, we'll consider how operators are increasingly rising to the challenge of retaining their legacy customers with their long-held, often fixed taste preferences, even as they work to entice Gen Z and a growing segment of the larger population who are no longer content with just damn the consequences, but delicious indulgence. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce our amazing presenter, Dr. Eric Rem. Dr. Rem is a professor of epidemiology and nutrition at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and a professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School. He's conducted extensive research on the health effects of diet and lifestyle in relation to obesity and chronic disease. Eric, thanks for opening us up today.
Thank you, Siobhan, and thank you, everybody. It's great to be here again, and I apologize, but in Boston we're having a thunder and lightning storm, so ignore the background rumbling. It's not my stomach. So let me get started. In 15 minutes, obviously, I can't summarize everything Siobhan said this session would be about, but let me just touch on some key ones. And most of your customers want to know, what about diet and immunity, cognitive function, weight loss? Those are probably the top three. And after that, people are always concerned about heart disease and cancer. So let me touch on just a few of these areas to get us to start our conversation. And since we've met since last year, there was the release of the 2020 to 2025 U.S. dietary guidelines. And this is really meant as a guide for health professionals or dietitians, not necessarily for the individual, but it's a great summary of the literature and sort of what's new and where we're heading. And I don't want to summarize that, but I just want to pull a figure from that shows sort of where we are. And maybe some of past presenters talked about this, but if on a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is the best diet, that's, plant forward. Over the last 15 years, we have been in the 56 to 60 range. So not only have we only gone up a little bit, but we're nowhere near what we would call a very healthy diet. So great room for improvement. We need your help, and hopefully your customers will demand help when visiting you. Thanks to COVID, a lot of your customers have spent a lot of time with Netflix. So I think there's still a growing interest in this. And I have to say, the joke about COVID-19 is that everybody gained 19 pounds. So I think there is a really keen interest now in people coming out of COVID, going to restaurants again, going to other eating establishments, trying to figure out what they can do to help lose some of that weight, but also to protect themselves. And some of these movies actually are quite good and do give great insights into plant forward and plant-based meals. If you have one that you haven't seen, I would suggest Game Changers, because the science there is quite impressive and also quite compelling stories in that movie. So let me get started by talking about diet and immunity. And this is probably, the most important question that people have asked. Is there a magic bullet that I can take to prevent COVID if I am infected? Or if I am infected, is there a magic bullet I can take to reduce symptoms? And there really, obviously, there's not a magic bullet. We all would have heard about it. But there are some good studies. There was some work that was just released in the last week from one of my colleagues at the Harvard Med School, along with some colleagues in the UK, where before the pandemic started, they actually created a COVID app. They could see it was coming and signed up over 1 million people in February and March to get information about their diets as well as other information, and continue to track people by the app. And what they found is that people that had plant-based diets were about 10% less likely to get COVID. Now, obviously, we all have heard that people who are overweight or obese are more likely to get COVID and are more likely to do poorly once infected with COVID. But they did find that those with plant-forward diets, regardless of how much they weighed, were slightly less likely to get COVID. So it's not one particular aspect of it, but was clearly people that had a higher diet quality that was in a plant-forward diet. I think what was most important from that study was that people that were infected were 40% less likely to get severe COVID symptoms. So I don't think that's a sort of a magic bullet where you can eat really poorly, get COVID, and then suddenly transform. I think it really had to do with building up the biology and the microbiome that goes along with sort of a healthy immune system. So those are really the key points. There's not like people have found that having a better vitamin D status after being infected with COVID can be helpful for reducing symptoms, but studies that have given people huge doses of vitamin D after they showed up in the hospital with COVID, those studies found no benefit from that vitamin D. So again, I think it's really important to stay very food focused. Cognitive function, that's another one that as our population ages, people are constantly asking questions about. No magic bullets necessarily, but there are really starting to be a stronger body of evidence around the Mediterranean diet. Now, specifically for neurologic disease, people have called it the MIND diet, so sort of a play on the acronym. It's a combination of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, and I have it listed here. This was from one of the best studies that is ongoing, that is experimentally testing the MIND diet among people with early cognitive decline to see if over a 3-year period, if you experimentally give people what is a MIND diet versus sort of just healthy advice about eating healthy and living healthy, what will be the impact of the MIND diet? And in this case, they gave them great advice on how to eat foods that you see in front of you, but also gave them blueberries, gave them nuts, and gave them olive oil to encourage them to eat healthy. Now, this trial has finished and the results will be out soon, so I think there will be great interest. I don't know the results. I hope that they will see benefit, they will see slowing of cognitive decline with age that they can attribute to a plant-forward diet as opposed to sort of the typical American diet. So maybe not surprising, but this will be the best test of this, especially the best test of this in an American population. Weight loss is something that's always on people's minds, and a lot of the phrases that we're hearing now that is used and starting to be used a little bit more objectively in the scientific literature is ultra processed foods. And look at the apple on the left and the donut on the right. That's pretty obvious what's ultra processed and what's not. But what about a smoothie? So if you think about what goes in a smoothie, an apple, some blueberries, and kale. So the apple, blueberry, and kale is a whole food. Once you put it in the blender and whip it at high temperatures for high speeds, then it's minimally processed because it's the same foods. But once you start adding guar gum and adding amino acids and adding a bunch of sugar and other things, then it becomes an ultra processed food. And the question is, does that change the health implications? And most of the science is now pointing to the fact that yes, having ultra processed foods does impact the health effects. And I think one of the reasons is that we just tend to eat more food if it's ultra processed. And there are starting to be more studies of this, and this is not the be-all and end-all study of it, but it really was the first time where scientists experimentally gave people ultra-processed foods and then gave them essentially the same foods that were unprocessed in terms of their macronutrient composition. So on the left, you see the ultra-processed diet, which may be a fish cake with cheeseburger, fish cake, highly processed bun, and a bunch of ketchup and mustard and things like that. On the right side may be also fish, but unprocessed on a bed of greens. And so the macronutrients are the same, and they fed them these diets for 2 weeks. And I want to have you focus on the top parts of this graph. They gave them the food, and then they said, if you want more, help yourself. And what it turns out is that people that were given the ultra-processed foods just kept eating more at every meal. The ultra-processed food was not as satiating. And so on the red line on the bottom are the people's diets that were on the unprocessed diets. Now, below you can see their weight change over 14 days. And I don't think anybody really believes ultimately this is the answer, because your body takes a month or a month and a half to metabolically adjust to a new diet. So I don't attribute the first 14 days to weight gain all due to the fact that it's ultra processed. But you can see as you get out to 14 days, there still is 200 or 300 or 400 calorie difference between the people given all they want of ultra processed foods versus the unprocessed diet. So that's something to keep an eye on. It may be hard to figure out how to put that on a menu in terms of selling it as a unprocessed. It's pretty obvious what's unprocessed, but I think trying to stick with unprocessed or minimally processed foods when you're serving bread or serving other types of foods that can be ultra processed, but it would be best if they're not processed or only minimally processed. Obviously, we're going towards other types of proteins, which are also ultra processed. This is a bunch of different things that are put into a plant-based meat. These are great for the environment. They dramatically decrease the impact on greenhouse gases, but in terms of their health, I think the jury's still out on that. There's been a few short-term studies that suggested that maybe they clearly are better than red meat, but I think the jury's still out on that. So they are ultra processed, and usually when you eat something like this, you're also having a bunch of French fries, you're having a bun, and you're having a bunch of condiments that are high in added sugar and they're quite ultra processed. So the question is, why are these healthy? And Siobhan sort of hinted at that early on. Well, these foods, we consume them and we metabolize them and we absorb a lot of the nutrients, but they also feed our gut microbiome. And some of those nutrients actually don't get into our bloodstream unless they're metabolized by our microbiome. I mean, for instance, a lot of those purples in the blueberry, a lot of the reds in the strawberries actually don't get absorbed and used metabolically unless they're broken down by the microbiome. But the one thing we like to feed our microbiome is fiber. That's really the number one thing that we've been studying for decades, is how the importance of feeding our microbiome fiber from plant and grain sources, because of the importance of the gut microbiome on not just metabolism of foods, but also a number of other factors, including immune function. So I think that's why it's been an exciting time during COVID-19 to try to understand, is there an interaction between the foods we're eating, specifically high fiber foods or fermented foods, and how it impacts our immune function. And we're really just starting to get hints of that. And, this was one of our first studies that we just published in the last 6 months. And I don't want to go into all the details of this, but on the x-axis is, how much fiber people were reporting they were consuming. And on the y-axis is their levels of inflammation in their blood. And typically what you would see is that people, look at the orange line, people who eat more fiber in their diets had lower levels of inflammation. And that's in line what you've seen in free living populations. But then we dug a little bit deeper and looked at their microbiome. And there was a relatively modest percentage of people that had this particular microbe. And if you had this microbe, it blocked the benefits of fiber. So that doesn't give us any answers on how to treat this or what to do about this, but it does tell us that there clearly is interaction between what's in your gut and what you're eating and how it impacts a number of factors, including inflammation. So I think there's so much more to come on this in this area, and it's so exciting because there's a lot of people working in it, and now there's tens or hundreds of thousands of samples being collected in people. So I think we're going to have insights into this very soon. And there's now companies that are building up around this. There's a company called Zoe where they've collected a lot of information. Look down here, they collected your weight and your height and all these different information. They've collected your diet, and they've collected a bunch of things in your blood, and then they fed people a bunch of diets and looked at what happened in their blood after they fed them diets. And then they came up with an algorithm saying, well, if we knew someone's microbiome and their genetics, could we predict what foods would be better for these people? And so these companies are just starting out. I think it's really too early for you to spend the $250 and to send a bit of poop and to send a bit of saliva to these companies, because I don't think we really know the answers yet. I follow the science, and we clearly don't know all the answers yet. But this is coming down the line in the next 5 years. There'll be more people walking into restaurants going, oh no, I can't have that, or I can have that because my microbiome is primed for that kind of diet. So that's coming. It's exciting, but we don't have the answers yet. So I think the takeaways from where we are with the science now is that plant-forward meals are usually consistent with planetary health. And I think, this whole conference is sort of based around that. And there can be healthy plant forward and there can be unhealthy plant forward. And so what I'm trying to say is we should focus on the healthy plant forward, having dark chocolate M&Ms and marshmallows, that's plant forward, but it's not healthy plant forward. So I think there's many signals suggest that the plant kingdom is very promising with multiple pathways to immune function, weight stability, cardiometabolic health, and maybe even cancer. So I think it's nice because it's all working in concert together. And I think having one, you can actually potentially have all of the benefits. And, I think we have to keep checking back and maybe not rely on the headlines from CNN or the New York Times, but trying to find conferences like this where we try to bring it all together, because there's really a vast ongoing research in this area. And I think there really will be almost monthly, but if not yearly, updates on where we are with the science. So I look forward to discussion, and thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. Great insights. Next, I want to ask our panelist, Pam Smith, to join us. Pam is a registered and licensed dietitian. She's the president and founder of Shaping America's Plate and co-chair of CIA's Healthy Menus R&D Collaborative. Now, Pam, really great stuff from Eric. I'd love to get your perspective as we start off this panel discussion.
Well, thank you, and a pleasure to be with all of you, and certainly to be on this panel with you, Dr. Rim and Siobhan. And honestly, Eric, as I listened and looked at the connection, you said it beautifully. There appears to be a little bit more of a symphonic move now. I remember 10 years ago, we talked about all the diet dilemmas and people on this diet for that, this diet for that, this diet for that. But one thing that has evolved is that people are kind of circling the wagon to understand that the plant-centered, plant-forward way of eating impacts all of those things that the consumer, our restaurant guest, is looking for. That little added edge of protection potentially against COVID, even with the vaccine. Complementary medicine, cognitive health, cardiometabolic health, losing a little bit of weight. All of a sudden, the focus is not on what to leave out of food, just cutting fat or salt or sugar, although that needs to be addressed. The bigger focus is what to put in. how to embrace a way of eating that's going to give those benefits. So it is an exciting time, and so much more to come.
You're right, Pam. I think the positive messages are so critical, right? What we frame and how we frame it for people, guests who are dining. And we heard a little bit about that earlier from Eve, the importance of framing positively. So I've got a few questions rolling in here from the audience, but I did want to just reflect, Eric, on some of the messages I heard from you, which were so helpful as I think about our audience. The Mediterranean diet, really leaning into that, knowing that there's a positive connection with those ingredients that make up the Mediterranean diet, minimally processed. So understanding and helping people know that it's okay to have a little bit of processing, taking whole foods, blending them together, that's A-okay. The notion of fiber too. So I think feeding the microbiome, these are very simple messages that our audience can take away today. Now, we've got an audience member that says, does dairy fit into the MIND diet? So that's a big question. Animal product, but does it fit as part of the MIND diet?
Yeah, I think it's not an important component. It's actually not. Initially, when the DASH diet was developed, dairy was there and consumed at relatively high quantities, but it's not an important part. I mean, I think the MIND diet tends to try to have people shy away from high-fat dairy. You're having a lot of high-fat cheese and things like that. So I would say high-fat dairy, not. I think having modest, doesn't need to be there, but people want to have, a glass of milk a day. I don't think it shies away from that.
Okay. It's also modeling the Mediterranean diet, correct? Which is minimal amounts of dairy. We think of them eating massive amounts of cheese, but it really is a part of their diet, but not to the extent that we oftentimes would imagine.
Yeah. Have some tea or some coffee or some water, or occasionally a glass of wine.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, great. Let me ask you, Pam, how are you seeing restaurants and food manufacturers respond to what's going on? Is there a renewed interest in offering better for you foods beyond just comfort and indulgence?
Great question. And I'm happy to say yes, because all that we really heard through COVID is all people wanted were fried chicken sandwiches or fried chicken in any way, mac and cheese, comfort, comfort, comfort. But what began to happen is people began to lift their eyes up to say, I want to be able to have foods that make me feel good, but I want to also have foods that can get me well, potentially keep me well, help me to age well. So it's almost fashioning into what we oftentimes call, health and wellness now, almost 4.0. Again, away from little hearts on a menu that say these things don't have the bad things, but instead focusing on what are the foods that can give me these kinds of nutrients that may not be superfoods, but gee golly, as a consumer, I sure want them. If blueberries could help, if green tea could help, a little red wine, maybe some Greek yogurt, I want to see that in my dishes, and restaurants are responding to that guest demand.
That's great. Well, speaking of restaurants, Eric, what's your impression about the variety of restaurants we're all seeing that have made some really interesting announcements about offering more plant-based foods, and in some cases making a pretty dramatic shift if we think about 11 Madison Park, who said they'll no longer serve meat or seafood?
Yeah, I think, it's a tough one. In some ways, it's people reaching out saying, I want to get where the next generation is going. Maybe it's sustainability. They're essentially making the point that sustainability is so important. We're going to make that as a banner item. But I think others are having a few more things that are vegetarian on the menu, or having a few more things that are plant forward, but just have a small piece of protein. So, I think it is sort of a whole shift of what's being put on menus to sort of wake up to the fact that there's a bunch of millennials that are ordering differently than my generation ordered, or the generation, half a generation younger than me. So I think it's exciting. I think it leads to a lot of creativity. And in some cases, it leads to just whole flat out messages by restaurants or restaurant chains saying, we are making this decision to move away from things that impact sustainability. And I think that's great. It gets the message out in many different ways.
Great.
That whipsaw doesn't have to happen so much so, though. We know that the guest is not always quite there. And that notion that, as Eric just said, that smaller amount of maybe high quality protein that's thoughtfully, mindfully sourced, while it becomes a co-star with all of those beautiful plants and grains that are on the plate. It's bringing plants to the center of the plate where proteins used to take up the huge amount of it. So there is a shift, and it's a seismic shift in the restaurant world.
That's such a nice way to position it. Let me ask you another question from the audience. What is the research on the microbiome in regards to animal and plant proteins? Eric, we'll let you talk.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about foods that we eat is you don't just get the protein, you get other aspects of what's in the plant. So if you're going to tell me what do we know about plant proteins, I'll tell you, well, we know that plant proteins have a lot of fiber, and that's where the strongest impacts are. And I mean, I think we are starting to do more work on things like leaky gut, which is kind of a term that's used loosely, where people that have highly processed red meat, it does lead to dysbiosis or dysfunction of some of the microbiome, which can lead to contents of the colon slowly leaking into your bloodstream. So those are the extremes. Like plant protein, clearly some of the protein is going to be beneficial as in itself as protein, but also because it comes with the package, the food package where there's fiber. And the highly processed bacon is going to have some other components to it that may be injurious to the microbiome, which may impact the colon and cause localized inflammation, which causes problems.
Thank you. Great perspective. I want to get to a couple more. We've got some really nice questions rolling in. So Pam, for you, what trends have you seen with low carb and keto showing up on menus or in the restaurant world?
Well, again, it's all cyclical, right? We saw that back in the early 2000s when it came under a different name, South Beach or Atkins, and now it's come back as paleo or keto, low carb. But back to this question about how do you feed the microbiome is really where it centers. And again, as a nutritionist, I would always say just that. How are you feeding your brain? How are you feeding your microbiome without the incredible nutraceuticals that are within plant foods when whole food groups have been cut out? And again, even though restaurants still are all about meeting the needs and the demands of their guests, may have items that still lean in that way, more and more it's building bowls, it's building dishes that can provide the very thing that the consumer that's evolving, and especially the Gen Zs, are starting to look for.
Thank you. Another question, and we're going to need to wrap it up. Eating seasonally can help to promote gut microbiome. Is that true? Eric?
Wow, that's I haven't seen good science on that. I mean, what we do know is that if you just eat probiotics all the time, they don't necessarily take up residence. It's good to feed your existing microbiome. Obviously, if you eat yogurt every day, that some of those microbes may stay there because you're eating it every day. So if you're changing over time, but some of the foods you're changing may have similar microbes, even though it's a different seasonal food. But I think there's clearly no harm in that. And if anything, you're getting fruits at their ripest and most delicious, and where they're stored not as long, and then you're getting grains or you're getting vegetables. So I think if anything, it speaks to sort of the healthfulness of the food you're eating, as opposed to something that's been stored for 9 months and maybe it's lost some of its nutrients.
Or transported, very far away. You're more apt to find seasonal foods more locally, and that's always a celebration.
Yeah, right. Speaks to sustainability more than your microbiome.
Right.
Great, really great perspectives. Thank you both. We all want to please our guests, our users. We know that there's a lot at stake as it relates to Planetary and health, the health perspectives that you all have shared. And I just want to thank you both for giving us really helpful insights as we leverage research and the related findings to help us guide our day-to-day considerations in the activities of the chefs and operators that are here with us around the table. So great session, a lot more to come. I'm going to turn it over to Jackie for our breakouts.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, and another thank you to Pam and Eric. Definitely fascinating insights. It sounds like there's lots more potential in understanding the interplay of food and diets and immunity and planetary sustainability. And of course, we have the poll question asking about immunity boosting foods on your menu. Let's see what your responses were. We asked if you're calling out immunity boosting foods on your menu, and it looks like the majority of you aren't sure if any of your items qualify for such claims. So again, points to needing some additional education and information around those kind of immunity boosting claims. And it looks like several of you are also taking a stealth health approach in terms of immunity. It looks like we've still got some room for people to share their responses in that poll. So head over there and let us know. And next, we'll be heading into our first round of breakout sessions, which are listed here for your reference, but don't hit that sessions button just yet, as I've got some directions for you. We know that all of the breakout sessions sound amazing, so don't worry. We'll be posting recordings of all of them, so you can watch whatever sessions you didn't make it to on demand after the conference. Immediately following the breakout sessions, we'll head to another Sustainability Innovation Hub and networking session where you'll have more chances to interact and engage and win great prizes. You can jump into a randomly assigned one-on-one chat with another attendee in the networking tab. Your starter question for today is, what is your primary sustainability priority in 2021? And we'll also be hosting Meet the Author booths where you can chat directly with our authors, Sophie Egan and Eve Thoreau-Paul, who you have already heard from, as well as Kevin Mitchell, who is the author of the forthcoming Taste the State, South Carolina's signature foods, recipes, and their stories, who will also be speaking in the upcoming breakout session. And our Sustainability Innovation Hub is still going strong. You can see from today's themes and activities that there is a lot going on in their booths. The activities will change throughout the summit, so be sure to visit often so you don't miss anything. After breakout sessions, we'll have networking, and then we'll see you all back on the main stage to discuss what post-pandemic sustainability priorities look like and how each of us can capitalize on the insights and energies of grassroots and intergovernmental movements to affect change within our own organizations. We'll be back here on the main stage at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. But in the meantime, go ahead and click that Sessions tab to head over to the breakout sessions.